With that title slide there, I really thought I ought to flourish my seniors card in front of you. Good morning. I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in the symposium. Doubly so when I see the great quality of those speaking and attending on this 20-year anniversary of events that led to the deployment of INTERFET. Triply so because I follow our greatest modern Prime Minister, the Honourable John Howard, my ultimate boss in those tumultuous times and in the years after that. As you imagine, I'm going to stick pretty close to my knitting in relation to the military aspects of both the deployment and its conduct, but with special emphasis on the outcomes and learnings which have helped shape the ADF's future structure, doctrine and employment. I'm glad we're doing this because to me, while the INTERFET operation was relatively short and bloodless, in many ways it created for the Army a sort of renaissance of both deployment in terms of sustainability and adaptability, and culturally in terms of the confidence and energy it imbued into the men and women in khaki. While Navy and Air Force both performed superbly, here too one might say there was a sort of renaissance, particularly in the matter of joint operations at long arm's reach, something we now see as both absolutely vital for credible defence posture in our region and further afield where we operate at long arm's reach into places we only read about 30 years ago. Before moving into addressing the useful framework that Tom provided, which will inevitably, even when we refer to East Timor, lead to some furious self-backpatting, let me lead off by saying that the true champions of 1999 were not the United States and its agencies, not Australia as a prominent proponent of the plebiscite, nor INTERFET, but the people of East Timor, who, notwithstanding enormous countervailing pressure, often lethal pressure, voted overwhelmingly for their independence. I'll move to the first of the questions posed to me by Tom. You know, we had a command and control structure before and during INTERFET, which I would describe in retrospect as cautiously experimental. At the top, we had the Chief of the Defence Force, who had command of all Australian military forces under the direction of the government. That is, of course, still the case. Supporting him in those days as a staff was a small joint element here at Russell officers under a two-star officer. That two-star reported directly to the Chief of the Defence Force. Of course, the CDF in those days, and still, also received detailed technical and operational employment advice from the service chiefs. This had been the case for a number of years, but the experimental reference I made in my earlier remark was that there was a relatively new construct. It was a joint headquarters co-located in Sydney with maritime headquarters. Now, this joint headquarters in Sydney was known as Headquarters Australian Theatre, another two-star headquarters which had its own quite substantial intelligence staff. So the commander of Headquarters AST was intended to exercise command and control over deployed elements where there was an operational mission to be accomplished, although, sidebar, there were some, we'll call them environmental or domain operations, which still remained separate under the control of the maritime commander, the land commander, the air commander. The Operation Bellisi in Bougainville, which is essentially a land-based operation. It's very small, but that was under the land commander. And there are others, surveillance operations conducted in the Pacific, those sorts of things, which still remained under the relevant service. So there was, however, one other operational entity, and that was vested in me at the time as the commander of Army's 1st Division with another hat. I was the commander of the Deployable Joint Force Headquarters. Now that was the headquarters upon which INTERFET was based. It was located in Brisbane. It was really a headquarters in waiting with an outline organisational diagram which showed the presence of maritime and air components on the headquarters, but these were skeleton manning. They were day-to-day, just 1 or 2 people, and it was supposed to be beefed up when there was a requirement. We, from time to time, took on extra people in maritime and air for a wider training in an exercise environment in Australia. As the name implied, though, it was thought that this headquarters, during time of need, would deploy forward to command an operational force, probably offshore in the region. It was envisaged that we would have a land-centric area of operations. That's why Army had most of the manning. And that the maritime and air assets that might be attached to you would probably be only those intimately involved in the area of operations. While some maritime and air assets, they would move in and out of the area where you were doing this operation. As soon as they left you, they would revert back to some administrative status under the air commander or the maritime commander. So we call it chopping in and chopping out, a technical term, but you'd only own them for a little bit of time. This system, which estranged the day-to-day exercise of operations from Canberra, because you can see all of the informational situational awareness that's in Sydney or in this deployed headquarters. That sort of removes that layer of activity and information from Canberra. That acknowledged the very good point that during major operational commitments, think about World War II, when we had, for example, about 500 people in Kharkiv alone, the processing of all that sort of information was well beyond what was happening in Melbourne, which was then Defence Headquarters. So it made sense that you had some level of detachment. It did have the effect of detaching strategic and political direction from the aegis of the deployed force. Now, it didn't take into account what we saw in INTERFET, because this was a large and remote force working in a single theatre of operations. What it didn't take into account, this experimental headquarters structure that we had in place, was the great diversity and immediacy of military communications, and again, the presence of mass media. So what this meant was we were a great outpouring of information. And of course, the way that resolved after INTERFET was deployed, and it was thought, even as we were deploying, how would we communicate? Who would we communicate to? And who needed access to us urgently and immediately? Well, to put it brutally, Headquarters Australian Theatre in Sydney was, from the first deployment of INTERFET, bypassed in terms of operational information and decisions. So I wasn't phoning up my great friend and colleague, Air Vice Marshal Bob Treloar, to say, here you are, Bob, I'm throwing a problem over my shoulder on the operational side, what do you think? That was going straight to Canberra. What Treloar's headquarters was used for and thoroughly exploited and relied upon was in terms of logistics and operational support. Now, since that experience, the ADF moved quickly to create a new senior structure for command and control, Headquarters Joint Operations Command, which now sits in Bungendore, stone's throw from Russell officers. Day-to-day operations there are under the control of a 3-star officer with a large headquarters. This returns the immediacy and of information and consultation with the CDF, and thus through CDF with government, into a very timely and convenient process. Before we had the facility at Bungendore, it took a few years to build up. When I was CDF for a while, I used the Vice Chief as the Chief of Joint Operations, more power. We didn't have the necessary staff. But the moment Bungendore was set up and operating, a separate commander at 3-star level was the logical way to go. And that's what we use today. Whereas with my earlier remarks about capability needing to be enhanced by doctrine or sort of command philosophical structure, we have another question. Let's talk about some of the learnings from our actual operations. I think the pointers INTERFET gave us in the areas of intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance remind me to refer to Little Hart. In his decades of writing about military conflict, he gave us the term the other side of the hill. In this evocative phrase, he was referring to the eternal passion of the military commander to know what was happening that would affect his or her force, and thus the mission. That knowledge is masked by distance, indivisibility, subterfuge on the part of an adversary, or simple ignorance, or lack of attention. At the higher levels of intelligence, while we were there in East Timor, we had plenty of service. We were getting all that was needed and available out of our fixed intelligence systems. You'll all be aware we're a beneficiary of being a very strong member of the Five Eyes community. We were receiving all that was necessary to know broadly about our environment. What would have been better if we had been able to access some of the emerging technologies that were even then being observed in other theatres. The sort of things I'm talking about were UAVs. They would have been of enormous tactical value. Remember that while we weren't running around having to shoot, we were certainly patrolling and wishing to dominate the area so that we could be quite confident the people of East Timor could get about their ordinary business in the absence of threat. So the capacity of a UAV to surveil, stare and transmit data from a remote area to the recipient, that would have been wonderful. And of course, I think what happened in the aftermath of INTERFET, this capability was underscored, and the ADF moved rapidly to improve its access and use of UAVs. Turning to logistics, which is always a very interesting subject within INTERFET. To me, it's largely a canard that our logistics nearly or actually broke. A sort of, for want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. I don't think we did too badly on several weeks' notice, deploying and supplying what ultimately was a force which in numbers looked like an army division. Remember, we were supplying a lot of our allies. And we were coming in through points of entry that looked like the port and airport of Coffs Harbour. So, of course, there were vulnerable times and the need for workarounds, but our logisticians performed wonders and maintained and gained marvellous experiences that have stood the ADF in great stead in the 20 years since. One might say from the INTERFET experience that logistic capability at arm's reach very much informed the major acquisitions of large amphibious and logistic shipping by the Royal Australian Navy, and informed the modernisation and expansion of the Royal Australian Air Force's transport fleet, particularly in the acquisition of C-17s. Now, these highly capable, highly flexible force elements are essential for projecting and sustaining military operations remote from forward bases in Australia. While there were no doubt many doctrinal and structural tweakings made within the ADF's broad logistic elements, which started then and have never stopped in the last 20 years, I believe those two major takeaways are shining lights of force structure outcomes that were accelerated as a result of the INTERFET experience. Now, right at the outset, I pointed out that the ADF had a system which was somewhat experimental in terms of our joint command structure. A major accomplishment of the preparation and conduct of INTERFET was the enormous cultural progress made at many levels within the three services in terms of understanding and recognition of the peculiarities and needs and capacities of 3 services in the 3 domains. 20 years on, youngsters who were naval lieutenant equivalents who worked together then they're star-ranked officers now, and they're still working together. Even though I retired 14 years ago, in my most recent incarnation, I've had the opportunity to observe on this cultural factor of jointery, and I believe it has created a wholly advantageous joint environment. And I believe it sets the Australian Defence Force in the front rank of nations who seek to exploit the synergies which to us are now natural. There are, of course, great contributors to this. Australian Defence Force Academy, Command and Staff College, the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies, many other ADF training courses, and naturally there are the joint headquarters and staff branches throughout the Department of Defence. It might be said that with our modest personnel numbers, we are in a sweet spot for this cultural factor to be as important as it is. But to me, in relation to INTERFET, well again, INTERFET didn't discover or invent this concept, but we gave it a good push along, and we must maintain it as a precious part of our capability. Jim Stapleton is here and a shining light of how we interoperated in that joint environment. Now, the ADF enjoys military relationships all around the globe. From the earliest days of our military history as a federation, we've had close relationships with the old country, Great Britain, with our New Zealand cousins, with the United States, and periodically and episodically with other nations' militaries. Of course, now Australia is such an international player, not least in the security area, that this level of familiarity is just getting wider and wider. Beyond the nations I've just mentioned, our relationship with the Indonesian military has for over 5 decades been a complex one, sometimes quite inimical, often cordial, always attentive. Before and during INTERFET, it might be said that the relationship had moved to the left of the dial. Yet it will not surprise you that part of my mantra to all of the Aussies and indeed to our coalition partners, that our job in East Timor was threefold. First, to restore peace and maintain that peace and security for East Timor. Secondly, to assist the United Nations to return and perform its functions. And thirdly, to improve our relationship with Indonesia. Of course, in using that verb, this acknowledged that this was an area of work which required more than lip service. How do we go? Books may be written on this, but commensurate with doing our job, I believe we were diligent, because many commanders, especially the Australians, they'd heard the mantra, and many more junior ranks because perhaps intuitively they realised that this relationship with Indonesia is not temporary, it's not a temporary novelty, it's a perpetual reality which will exceed all our lifetimes. The proof of the pudding comes later and after a number of other bumps in the road. The bumps in the road, the Bali attacks, the Bali 9, for example. The Asian tsunami provided in 2004 a turning point. That's when Australia, led by Mr Howard's government, in a stunning outpouring of public sympathy and support, showed the Australian character in its very best light. It might have been said that if I was persona non grata as a military leader in the archipelago, but in that near aftermath of the tsunami and Australia's magnificent response, I was welcomed back to Jakarta. And a visit to Australia soon after the death of our folk on the helicopter crash on Nias Island, President Yudhoyono stood at the foot of the caskets of those killed on a relief operation in his homeland. To me, that was a sign that at the time that the relationship military to military was restored. There's an example of this, albeit quiet pathway to continued understanding. It's called the Ikahan program. This is where generally retired ADF officers, TNI officers, and some other experts engage in a second track dialogue, alternating the venue between Australia and Indonesia. Our present Governor-General is a strong proponent, as am I, yours truly. That said, just as in most of our other bilateral relations, there should be no comfortable assumptions about the need for sensitivity and vigour and understanding and compromise in that relationship with Indonesia. It should always proceed on the basis that we need each other, and there's no end to that need. Turning to the United Nations. Before INTERFET, we had a splendid peacekeeping record with the UN, and John referred to the Cambodia experience. This goes back to the UN's earliest days, when our peacekeepers, generally in small groups, worked under its flag. Of course, in Korea, we fought under the benediction of the UN. We speak about Namibia, Cambodia. Our people did extraordinarily well. John's referred to the involvement in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the UN's concern about the nature of those deployments. Now, UN Security Council Resolution 1264 took us on a new path. That's the one for East Timor, where the intervention force was empowered to take all necessary steps to restore peace and security. Now, there's no modesty involved in saying this. I think that the UN was relieved and uplifted that the mission was accomplished swiftly and relatively bloodlessly, and that East Timor was moved quickly to nationhood. So in the sense of statecraft, politics, national determination and military outcomes, I think you could say that Australia's stocks with the United Nations remain very high. Of course, like all wealthy countries with a developed economy and a stable pluralistic government, we get our share of criticism from the international community using the UN as an echo chamber. But amongst the lifters and the leaners, all nations would place us in the former category. This perception wasn't created by INTERFET, but as an outcome, it's been heavily underscored. Now, I'm going to have to move to a conclusion quite rapidly. There are things that we learn about coalitions. Leadership of a coalition, managing a coalition, and levels of force. I'll save the levels of force part for the 4,000-word essay at the end. Leadership of a coalition is understandably much more complex than command of a unified force. Not only is there a need to ensure that the missions attempted are attainable and acceptable within the force, but to the degree possible, the coalition commander and staff acknowledge the reality that coalition members are somewhere between elements that are indisputably under command and the other end of the spectrum, they're stakeholders who are continually applying local and national interests and influences to their buy-in. So there's very much a twin-track nature to the conduct of operations by coalitions. First, there's the rigorous military decisions about needs and responses, and secondly, the art of the reasonable and the attainable of burden sharing within the coalition. And crucially, the way this is digested in coalition members' home nations. We went into the subsequent Ramsey mission in later 2003 with an eyes wide open manner, and I think that was helped by our experience in INTERFET. Now, managing within the coalition has elements of managing within a joint force. It requires understanding, diligence, an unending determination to embrace the needs and differences of the coalition membership. Look, in INTERFET we had liaison officers, staff officers on a daily basis monitoring and working upon relations between Australia and the coalition partner. General Mark Kelly, my Chief of Staff then, was a past master at coming to me with not only the problem du jour with a coalition partner, but the way ahead, frequently having already solved it. I believe that in Ramsey, that was again a very important conditioning experience for our leadership of Ramsey. Time to conclude with a few summary remarks about where we stand with our relationship with East Timor. Let's run forward to that slide. Now let's talk about that. I agree with John Howard that the relationship with East Timor is special, but let's put some context around that. The most important factor for us to remember here is the efflux of time, 20 years. Today, East Timor is a small nation, it's a close neighbour, it's a close friend. It is important to Australia, pause, as are all our neighbours. There is no sense of permanent, unique obligation, either which is either superior or more pressing or less pragmatic than that which we have with our other neighbours. Let me develop that. Let's take an example, Papua New Guinea. In 1998, as commander of the 1st Division, I controlled a post-tsunami relief operation in the northern regions of New Guinea. We had a poster made which was emblematic of the wonderful work being done by our surgical and medical teams in Vonimo on New Guinea's north coast. This poster showed a fuzzy wuzzy angel in a lap leading a blinded Australian digger down the Kokoda track. You will have all seen that photo. Underneath that photo, same poster, was a post-tsunami photo of 2 Aussie military medics kneeling beside a stretcher with a child victim of the tsunami, and in the background was a Caribou aircraft. Now, the written caption in English and Pidgin was on the top photo, the fuzzy wuzzy angel. We will always remember. And on the photograph underneath was this: we will always be there. And on the photograph, it says it all. It says it for East Timor, and it says it for our other beloved neighbours in our region. It said it for Indonesia in 2004. It will say it again wherever we are needed. It's our nature. Now, East Timor and INTERFET was a watershed moment for Australia and for the ADF. For the latter, I can say with confidence as the subsequent Chief of Army and then CDF, it was a renaissance. The men and women of the Australian Defence Force affirmed that they were worthy successors to those who had gone before and were the future leaders of the magnificent men and women who wear our uniform today. Of course, there are many lessons to be derived. I've referred to some of them. There'll be others examined today. But I can leave you with this thought. There is a continuity to the professionalism and dedication of our men and women in the ADF. It simply requires the wisdom and determination of governments to use them for the good of this country. And consequent upon that, the beloved acknowledgement of the ordinary Australians they serve. I've finished.
We have time for just the one question before morning tea. Who will that be? Ant's question here. Thank you.
My name is Lucy. I'm from the ACMC, but I'm also a defence graduate. I'm just interested in your opinion about military diplomacy when working within an intervention. Do you find it to be a strength, or does it sometimes pose a weakness?
It's the easiest way to go wrong. It can be a danger for anybody from a private soldier through to a general, admiral, air marshal. It's something which you don't expect your military people to be practicing diplomats, but they do have to understand that when cultures, missions, even social attitudes rub up against one another, offence is so much easier to engender than goodwill. You work hard at it. My greatest military diplomacy from a junior rank I saw was a sergeant in East Timor, day 3 or something of the operation, with his rifle slung across his back, out there with a piece of paling and a tennis ball playing cricket with East Timorese kids. I was running around looking for every journalist I could find to say, photograph that, you'll like that. And I found one or two. But look, that's sort of tactile diplomacy, it's osmosis. But I think military people, as they get more senior, have to understand what's at play. And they don't actually have to have what I might call the practiced and articulate, maybe even glib patter of a diplomat, but they have to understand what's at play. We had an Indonesian leftover group. Satgas was its sort of, there's an Indonesian series of words there. Its abbreviation was Satgas, and they were like a little observer mission of experienced Indonesian politicians and diplomats who remained for a while in Dili after all the military had gone. And they were, if you like, my daily. I encountered them daily, and it was always a jovial meeting. So, you know, you're diligent. It's very important. All right, thank you.
Please thank General Cosgrove.